In the summer of 1794, Horatio Nelson lost the sight in his right eye during a battle on a small Mediterranean island. That island was also the birthplace of Napoleon Bonaparte, and for 2 years it was British. The island is Corsica, and how it ended up under the British crown is a story involving revolution, historical sliding doors, and one of the most unlikely political experiments in the history of the British Empire. This is the story of the Anglo-Corsican Kingdom. To understand how this happened, we need to meet the man who made it possible, and who has almost entirely vanished from British history. Corsican nationalist, republican and folk hero Pascal Paoli, a strange bedfellow for the British Empire indeed. Corsica, which lies about 60 miles west of the Italian peninsula, had been under Genoese rule for centuries. By the 1720s, the Corsicans had risen in revolt. Following a 26-year war of independence, Pascal Paoli proclaimed the island an independent republic in 1755. 20 years before the American Declaration of Independence, and over 30 before the French Revolution, he introduced a progressive constitution and was elected leader. His ideas of independence, democracy and liberty enthralled thinkers throughout Europe, such as Voltaire. James Boswell, famous for his biography of Samuel Johnson, raved about Paoli and his enlightened government in his book An Account of Corsica, published in 1768. But that very year, everything changed for Paoli and the Corsican people. Genoa, who still claimed sovereignty over the island but were unable to enforce it, sold the island to France. And the French, still a monarchy at this time, certainly had the means to enforce their authority, especially over dangerous, as they saw them, republicans. They invaded, occupied the island, and Paoli fled to London. There he spent the next 20 years as a celebrity exile, waiting until the pendulum swung back the other way. And that moment came in 1789, the French Revolution. Paoli was welcomed as a hero by the revolutionaries in Paris, given the rank of Lieutenant General, and was cheered on his way to Corsica, where he arrived as a hero. However, the honeymoon didn't last. When King Louis XVI was executed, Paoli broke with Paris and once more declared Corsica independent. The National Convention in Paris declared him a traitor and ordered his arrest. Among those sent to enforce French authority on the island was a young Corsican-born artillery officer, Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, I'm sure that many of you will know that one of the towering figures of French history came from Corsica. What you might not know was that his father had been a Corsican nationalist and supported Paoli's original republic. It was only when France invaded in 1769 that his father switched allegiance, which, incidentally, smoothed the way for his son to attend a military academy in France. So as a three-way civil war erupted in Corsica between nationalists, monarchists and republicans, Napoleon found himself opposing his father's old hero, Paoli. Things didn't go well for the young officer. In May 1793, Napoleon was riding to Bastia when Paoli's men arrested him. He was held briefly and then managed to escape, fleeing on horseback through the Corsican countryside. Days later, his mother and the rest of the family narrowly escaped the ransacking of their house, and the whole Bonaparte clan swiftly fled by boat to the French mainland. Let's just apply the brakes to history here. Imagine if Paoli's men hadn't allowed their captive to escape. The history of Europe might have been very different. At around the same time as the Bonaparte family were fleeing Corsica, French royalists had handed the great naval port of Toulon to a British fleet under Admiral Lord Hood. Hood moved in, seized the harbour and, crucially, much of the French Mediterranean fleet along with it. Hood's flagship was HMS Victory. Yes, that HMS Victory. And one of Hood's captains, commanding HMS Agamemnon, was a certain Horatio Nelson. And now here's another sliding door moment. On the other side of the siege lines, directing the French artillery that would eventually drive Hood out of Toulon in December 1793, was young Napoleon Bonaparte. By December of that year, Napoleon had played a key role in driving the British fleet from Toulon. That French victory left Britain without a close Mediterranean base to continue her war with Republican France. But now an alternative option arrived, right on time. Over in Corsica, Paoli, who had declared Corsican independence, was still fighting French Republican forces who held several key towns on the north coast. He now asked the British for help. Here was the alternative base that the British were looking for. In February 1794, a British expeditionary force landed on Corsica and advanced on the French-held towns. The sizable force comprised of detachments from the 11th, Devonshires, 25th, King's Own Scottish Borderers, 30th, the Cambridgeshires, 50th, Queen's Own, and 69th, South Lincolnshire, regiments of foot. They were joined by Royal Marines from the fleet, along with naval brigades manning guns. First target was San Fiorenzo, where they ran up against ferocious resistance from a circular stone watchtower called Torre di Mortella. The British were so impressed by the robustness of the tower that they built copies of it all around the coasts of England and Ireland. Those Martello towers can still be seen today. I bet you didn't know that connection. The next target was the port of Bastia. The town endured a 6-week siege, with Hood's fleet, including his flagship HMS Victory, blockading the harbour, and a naval brigade, under Captain Horatio Nelson, fighting ashore alongside the army. After 37 days, the French garrison finally surrendered. Nelson called it the most glorious sight that an Englishman could bring about. The 30th Regiment of Foot's successor regiment, the Duke of Lancaster's, still lays a wreath at the foot of Nelson's column every Trafalgar Day, inscribed simply, Bastia, 1794. Finally, it was the turn of Calvi, the hardest fight of them all. The army was now commanded by General Charles Stuart, son of a former British Prime Minister, Lord Bute, veteran of the American War, and a man whose talent for quarrelling was almost equal to his talent for soldiering. His adjutant general was Colonel John Moore, the same John Moore who would later die leading British forces at the Battle of Corunna in the Peninsular War. The British troops and naval tars hauled artillery up steep mountain slopes to fire down on the French forts below. The French commander, General Raphael de Casabianca, replied to a British demand to surrender with his town's Latin motto, which translated reads, "Calvi is always faithful." We'll come back to that name, Casabianca, because it echoes through the story in a way you won't expect. It was during the bombardment of Calvi on the 12th of July that Nelson was directing fire from an exposed battery when a cannonball struck a nearby sandbag. Sand, stones and debris blasted into his right eye. Contrary to what many people think, he never wore an eye patch, but he was never able to see out of it again. Meanwhile, Calvi surrendered on the 10th of August. Britain had just conquered an island, but now a strange thing happened. Rather than simply absorb it into the British Empire, the British let Republican nationalist Pascal Paoli retain control. And in return, in June 1794, Paoli's government recognised King George III as their own king. The constitutional arrangement was as curious as the island's new flag, incorporating the Moor's Head of Corsica with King George's coat of arms. The Anglo-Corsican Kingdom was a dual monarchy. In other words, Great Britain and Corsica shared the same monarch, military and foreign policies, but were independent of each other when it came to domestic policy. There were precedents in British history. For instance, when James VI of Scotland succeeded to the English throne as James I. Two separate kingdoms just happened to share the same monarch. And indeed, at this time, Great Britain and Ireland were also a dual monarchy. It was the Irish model that Paoli was following. To represent the king, a viceroy was appointed. Sir Gilbert Elliot, a Scottish Whig MP and friend of radical Edmund Burke, who'd been one of Burke's keenest supporters during the impeachment of Warren Hastings. The effective Prime Minister of the new kingdom was Carlo Pozzo di Borgo, a Corsican nobleman of the old school, educated in Pisa, and in his younger days, a close political ally of the Bonaparte family. That friendship had since curdled into something approaching hatred, and we'll come back to him too. Now the story becomes genuinely astonishing. The Anglo-Corsican Constitution of June 1794 gave the vote to all male property owners. Now, nothing particularly unusual about that at that time, except in Corsica, almost every male did own property. So, effectively, this possession of the King of Great Britain had near universal male suffrage, whereas just 3% of the British population could vote for the Parliament in London. Indeed, the majority of British men wouldn't receive the vote until the 1880s, and not all men until 1918. Corsica was there in 1794. However, the relationship between the Corsicans and the British was fractious almost from the start. Paoli wanted Corsican self-determination. Eliot was loyal to the power of the British Crown. Somehow, he hadn't quite got why the American colonists had rebelled. The Viceroy moved the capital from Paoli's inland stronghold of Corte to the coastal city of Bastia, a more pro-French, although monarchist rather than republican, stronghold. Paoli saw this as both a slight and an attempt by Eliot to create a rival power base. When the Viceroy removed a bust of Paoli, there was nearly a full-scale revolt by the nationalists. I think you're getting the idea that this Anglo-Corsican Kingdom was not necessarily a marriage made in heaven. In reality, the Corsicans wanted to do their own thing, but just wanted British military protection. Meanwhile, the British didn't want to rule Corsica, they just wanted to use her ports to fight the French. And it wasn't as if Corsica was adding to Britain's financial coffers. Far from it. The annual cost of this Anglo-Corsican dual monarchy was costing the British taxpayer the equivalent of £50 million in today's money. In fact, for every pound the British gained in tax revenue from the Corsicans, they were shelling out 25. The Corsicans, meanwhile, had a deep-rooted aversion to taxation that made collection almost impossible. So when the British suggested a larger contribution from the locals in 1796, an uprising, the Campo Rebellion, broke out. British control of Corsica was shaking. The killer blow, however, came not from Corsica, but from Madrid. In August 1796, Spain switched sides in the war and now joined France against Britain. Suddenly, the Spanish fleet threatened Gibraltar. Britain's forces were overstretched across the entire Mediterranean, and Corsica, expensive, turbulent, and now exposed, became indefensible. Orders went out to strip the Corsican garrison back to reinforce Gibraltar. When the news broke on the island, the simmering resentments boiled over. Revolutionary committees appeared in towns across Corsica, negotiating with the French. On the 14th of October, Nelson, who'd remained in Corsican waters, sailed into Bastia harbour and forced the committees to disperse, at gunpoint. It was the last time the British tried to exercise their authority on the island. By now, the British evacuation was well underway. Less than a week later, on the 19th of October, Eliot, his staff, Paolo, Pozzo di Borgo and 370 Corsican refugees who'd thrown in their lot with the British, boarded Nelson's convoy and sailed away. A French fleet arrived in Bastia the same day, and Corsica became two departments of France. The Anglo-Corsican Kingdom had lasted 2 years and 4 months. Paoli, pensioned off by the Crown, returned to London for the last time. He died there in 1807, aged 81, never having seen a free Corsica. He was buried in London, though his remains were later returned to his homeland. And today, his statue stands in virtually every town on the island, probably more venerated than Napoleon. Pozzo di Borgo spent the rest of his life dedicated to one purpose: destroying Napoleon Bonaparte. He entered Russian diplomatic service, helped bring Sweden into the coalition against France, and was present at Waterloo, where he was lightly wounded. He ended his career as Russian ambassador in Paris, and died there in 1842, having outlived his great enemy by 21 years. And do you remember Rafael de Casabianca, the man who held Calvi against Nelson? Well, his brother Luke commanded the French flagship, L'Orient, at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, where Nelson, he's here again in this story, destroyed the French fleet. Luke died before his flagship exploded. His young 10-year-old son was also on board. The boy had been ordered by his father to remain at his post until called, but as his father was dead, he never was. And so he bravely stayed at his post on the burning ship and was killed in the explosion. In 1826, Felicia Hemans wrote a poem about the event. It began, "The boy stood on the burning deck." You might have learnt that at school, and now you know what it was about, and how it connects to the short-lived Anglo-Corsican Kingdom. So, the next time someone asks you where Nelson lost his sight, you know the answer, and you know the story behind it. The Martello Towers around the British coast, why there's a wreath at Nelson's column every Trafalgar Day bearing the words Bastia and not Trafalgar, and why there's a bust of a Corsican nationalist called Paoli in Westminster Abbey. And you know, one of the strangest footnotes in British constitutional history, a 2-year kingdom on a Mediterranean island that was, by any measure, more democratic than Britain itself. If this kind of story is your thing, the overlooked corners of British history that never quite made the textbooks, I write about them every week in my free newsletter. Click on the link in the description to get your copy. And if you want to support my work, there are links in the description too. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.